So, boa tarde, good afternoon. My name is James Green. I'm the director of the Brazil Initiative at Brown University. And I'd like to welcome you all to our initial activity of the semester. We have an amazing array of activities sponsored by the Brazil Initiative over the course of spring 2017. And we're really honored to kick it off with today's lecturer. Before I introduce our speaker today, our guest speaker, I'd like to ask Ramon Stern, who is the person who makes all this happen, who's the person behind the scenes that organizes the events and has actually put together this amazing programming, to talk a little bit about some of the featured activities for the semester. Ramon.
So as Jim said, my name is Ramon Stern, and I'm the administrative manager of the Brazil Initiative and the Brazilian Studies Association here at Brown. We have quite a few events, and I obviously can't read them all out to you. I have, if people are interested, they can approach me. I have a few printed out. But we have a film series about rural Brazil, including classical and contemporary films that, depending on what the situation is tomorrow, may kick off tomorrow and be mostly a weekly thing. We have, in addition to today's lecture, we have a lecture next week with Felipe Loureiro about the Alliance for Progress, U.S. economic aid to Brazil states during the administration of João Goulart. We have events dealing with lesbian women, the right-wing backlash in Brazil, a Chorinho concert, black group attachment and political opinion, militias and politics in 19th century Brazil. We also are bringing a Afro-Brazilian visual artist named Thiago Gualberto to give a lecture, but also to put on an art exhibit at Rhode Island State Council for the Arts Atrium Gallery at 1 Capitol Hill. So that's something to look forward to in March and April. And we will also have a few other lectures near the end of the semester that I'll bring your attention to, and a workshop also about Brazilian dictatorship. So there's a lot going on this semester, and we hope to see you at as many events as possible.
And if you are not on our mailing list and would like to receive information about our events, please contact Ramon and he'll put you on. He'd be glad to do that.
Yeah, just email brazil@brown.edu.
Brazil@brown.edu. That's wonderful. Thank you. So it's with tremendous pleasure that I introduce Vania Peña-Lopez, who she reminded me yesterday I met in 2004 at a lecture in New York, and we've become friends as a result of that. She's a professor of sociology at Bloomfield College in New Jersey. She is also the co-chair of the Brazil Seminar at Columbia University. And for those of you who don't know about the Brazil Seminar, it's one of the oldest ongoing institutes of Brazilian studies in the United States, functioning since the 1960s. She was a member of the executive committee of the Brazilian Studies Association, BRASA, from 2010 to 2014. A native of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Dr. Peña-Lopez graduated with honors from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro with a bachelor's degree in social sciences. And she also graduated, she's a graduate of New York University with a master's degree in anthropology in 1987 and a PhD in sociology in 1999. In fact, her undergraduate degree was in social sciences, and so she has the rarity, I think, of a lot of social scientists to be really have deep knowledge in two subfields of the social sciences, anthropology and sociology. As a postdoctoral fellow at the Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, she did research on the first graduating class of Brazilian university quota students. She has received a number of awards, including the Carter G. Woodson Institute Predoctoral Fellowship in Afro-American and African Studies from the University of Virginia, and the Scholarship for Study Abroad from the Encyclopedia Britannica do Brasil, of which she was the youngest recipient. Dr. Peña-Lopez has lectured extensively on comparative race relations, African-American fatherhood and racism in Brazil, and has been interviewed for articles in diverse issues in higher education, O Estado de São Paulo, and the Washington Post. Her works have been cited in numbers of books on race relations and textbooks and peer-reviewed articles, and she is the author of the author of the book Pioneiros Cotistas na Universidade Brasileira, and co-editor of Religiosidade, Performance, Diálogos Contemporâneos, and will be very celebrating her soon-to-be launched book about which she'll be talking today. So, Vanya.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you, Ramon, for making the arrangements. And thank you for coming to listen to me. So, if you saw the announcement, the poster for my presentation, there was I was going to talk about the changes that are expected to happen concerning affirmative action in Brazil with the new government. But then, that was in October that I sent that information. But then last week, as I was preparing to come here, I thought, well, but if we read papers or watch a little bit of Brazilian TV news, we can get what's going to happen with all the social policies in Brazil. But what really inspired me to do the study were the quota students themselves, because there was a lot of controversy in Brazil about affirmative action, that they were unconstitutional, that they were anti-meritocratic. But in the midst of all that debate, we seldom heard the voices of those who were, in fact, in universities because of those policies. So then I'm not going to be talking about Temer today. We can talk about it, during the discussion, but I will talk to you today about how these quota students, whom I will call cotistas, right, that's the term in Portuguese, how they view their own racial identity and in view of having gone to university because of racial quotas, okay? So regardless of the debate about this would help, right, about the legitimacy of and the need for affirmative action policies in Brazil, it is undeniable that the adoption of racial quotas is provoking a reevaluation of the meaning of race for the personal identity of Brazilians. Obviously, here I refer to race as a social construct and not as a biological reality. Though we know that biologists have long abandoned the concept of race and that recent studies have demonstrated the predominance of a genetic mixture among Brazilians, human beings continue to interpret phenotypical attributes, especially skin color, hair texture, and facial features, in order to classify one another both formally and informally. We also know that race is a significant criterion in societies with a slavery past, such as the ones that flourished in the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. Because that past survives through either ancestry or mark, to this day people continue either to benefit or to suffer from the way they look. In Brazil's case, that situation is complicated by the fact that, on the one hand, racial classification, which results from the encouragement and recognition of miscegenation, is so fluid and ambiguous that it leads some to conclude that it is irrelevant. On the other hand, our racial classification is rigid enough when we compare the differences in income, occupation, education, and observe how they are all related to race. As Salles dos Santos, a Brazilian sociologist, put it, this is a quote, "In Brazil, we are not blind to the color or race of individuals, but to racism and its consequences." The possibility of seeking admission to the university via racial quotas leads candidates to fit themselves into a given race. Because that is officially a new activity in Brazil, racial self-declaration becomes an empirical question. In principle, that is not a problem if the students already saw themselves as members of the categories that they chose. What happens, however, to those who had heretofore minimized their racial identity? For example, what are the consequences of self-declaration for those who are used to identifying themselves as white, as brancos, due to their looks, even when they know that some of their ancestors are not white? Would that make their self-classification less legitimate? Would it extend itself to the point of completely transforming their racial identity? Of all the 2,971 freshmen at UERJ at the State University of Rio in 2003, over two-thirds of them declared themselves negros, right, blacks. In the following year, more than 50% of the quota freshmen opted for quotas for public students. Similar proportions were observed among the social sciences and the College of Dentistry in the first 2 years of the implementation of the policy. And those were the two colleges that I focused on because they are so different in terms of prestige, admission to the university, competition to get in. The College of Dentistry is traditionally very elite, or at least was until the implementation of quotas, and social sciences were, less prestigious. And I interviewed 22 such students, 14 from the social sciences and 8 from the College of Dentistry. So 10 of the 22 respondents opted for racial quotas. Their explanations vary. Curiously, only one pointed to her own racial identity, and she says, this is Monica, who started in the social sciences in 2004. She says, it was very explicit because I'm a descendant. My grandparents are black. Although I have a grandmother who is India, who's indigenous, my 3 other grandparents are negros. 2 other respondents, also from the social sciences, confessed that they made their choices without much reflection. For example, Leila, who started in 2003, shows a lack of knowledge of the process. She says, I was sincere. At that time, I wasn't very aware of what was happening. I didn't know for sure there would really be quotas, For me, it was like on a questionnaire level, maybe this chance could come up. I wasn't sure that would happen. The 6 other racial cotistas tended to opt for that category of quotas by elimination. In other words, because they had studied in private schools at some point, they were not allowed to opt for the public school quotas. Janice, a 24-year-old who recounted several episodes of racial discrimination she had undergone and who was a social sciences freshman in 2004, declared herself negra because I couldn't pick the public option, right? Because I had once gone to a private school. The entire trajectory has to have been in public schools, both grammar and middle schools. Anna, another 26-year-old social science student, confirms that rationale. She says, I opted for the category for blacks because I consider myself parda, brown. I could have done it through public school or Afro-descendant quotas, but I was afraid because I had gone to school out of state in Pernambuco. Otávio, 23, a dental student who had gone to private schools throughout his life and had enrolled at a prestigious college preparatory course before entering UERJ, opted for racial quotas, quote, because I don't think that I'm white. It's not like I lied or anything. It is interesting that Otávio feels the need to affirm that he did not lie about his racial classification rather than admitting that it would have been impossible for him to choose any other type of quota. 8 respondents, 5 of whom were social sciences majors, got in by opting for the public school quotas. As expected, among them are the only 2 who consider themselves white in my sample, and also one who, because he does not consider himself black, thought it would be unfair to mark black just to secure a slot. Therefore, they all 3 saw the public school quotas as their only way. In contrast, 2 other interviewees opted for the public school quotas because, though they are not white, they regarded them as more viable than the racial quotas. And I'll stop here because this guy's name is Eriovaldo. Of course, all the names are fictitious, and I asked the students to pick a name for themselves, or I would come up with names. So this guy said, yeah, I'm Eriovaldo. And I'm telling you this because later on there will be a Beyonce. And then people's like, oh, well, how come she's Beyonce? Because she wanted to be. Okay, so you've been warned. So Eriovaldo, 29 years old from the social sciences, was not in favor of quotas for blacks. And 20-year-old Olivia, who started to study social sciences in 2004, discarded that option because she feared competition from blacks. She says, I talked to a teacher who was a friend of my mother's and also a friend of mine whose daughter also got in through the public quotas. My friend is blonde, and she said, I think you should opt for the public quota because you don't know which school the black candidates went to. There are many blacks who came from very good schools. Are you going to compete with them? The other four interviewees saw the public school option as their right. Sandra, 21, studying to be a dentist, summarized the opinion of several when she asserted, I studied in public schools all my life, right? Therefore, I was entitled to this privilege. And it's worth noting that the notions of right and privilege do not appear in any of the narratives of the racial quotas option, notwithstanding the fact that that policy had first been proposed as a measure against the longstanding de facto exclusion of blacks from higher education, which would bring it close to the idea of a social right. On the other hand, opinions contrary to racial quotas tend to view them as undeserving privilege. Finally, four interviewees opted for the double quotas. In other words, they declare themselves at once black and former public school students, and that was required in 2003. After that, the law changed, and people couldn't pick two. But at the time, they had to pick two if it had to do with them. These testimonies suggest that the students' decisions regarding quota options resulted from their considerations of their educational trajectories, their chances of being admitted, their perceptions of the notions of right and privilege, and even the fear of giving the impression that they were committing fraud. Although several candidates considered their racial identity when opting for quotas, that was not automatic, just as not all of those who saw themselves as black or brown or negro, preto, pardo, opted for the racial quotas. Not all of those who opted for the racial quotas completely saw themselves as black or brown. In fact, four categories of racial identity emerged from my interviews: negra, black; parda, which could be translated as brown; incerta, unsure; and branca, white. When asked about how they classify themselves racially, half of my respondents responded negra or negro, right, black. For the majority, that self-classification is obvious and indisputable, be it as a matter of phenotype or of ancestry or both. As for the first case, social sciences student Teresa, 24, who was raised in the Assembly of God Church, where African references were regarded as demonic, explains, come on, it's not possible to think much differently. To say that there is only human race? Okay, in the DNA and everything else there is, but socially there is a race, there are races, period. Monica refers to her ancestry to define herself. I am negra. Though people insist on pointing to this thing of my skin tone to say that I'm a bit lighter, yes, many insist on saying, oh, but you have lighter skin. But I prefer to see it through my ancestry, my grandparents. Alice, 21, a future dentist, combined the two criteria, citing the mirror, my parents, everybody, my family who look like me. The so-called Negroid characteristics, especially skin tone and hair texture, had a marked presence in the respondents' construction of racial identity, not only because they are references, but also because they stigmatize individuals. Dandara, who strongly identifies with a sense of negritude, illustrates the negative situations to which she was subjected when growing up due to her phenotype. They tried to say when I was called monkey, macaca, when I was made to feel inferior because my hair is the kinkiest possible. It's that one that you comb and pretty soon it turns into dreads. Today it's straightened. Is it straightened? I asked. Yes, because I made a bun and then I released it, you understand? But if it gets wet, it'll shrink. When were you called monkey? All my life at school. I didn't even like going to school. I remember a boy said to me when I was already in high school in chemistry class, in order for you to talk to me, you have to at least rub flour on your body. I was called Cafu, who, those of you who remember, was the captain of our team who won the 2002 World Cup. I was called Blue. I was called Benedita after Benedita, the ex-governor and senator from Rio. Remember that fad of little hairbands? Remember that Benedita wore 2 hairbands? At that time, my father died when I was 7. My father didn't let me straighten my hair, so I wore my hair braided. When I went out on the street, I was called Medusa. Having Negroid features and being insulted may lead to the opposite reaction, however, the total rejection of a Black identity. That happened to Janice, also social sciences student. Born and raised in Porto Alegre, in the south of Brazil, she was called monkey and ugly on the streets. She also wished to stop going to school to avoid its discriminatory climate. Unlike Dandara, however, Janice ended up suppressing her blackness, which remained dormant until 2001, so about 5 years before I interviewed her. When already living in Rio, she attended a lecture on Black consciousness raising at the college preparatory courses for Negros and the Needy, where she studied. And she says, one time it was really funny. They would bring in some people to give talks, right? And one time they brought a teacher to talk about this Black thing. And she was talking there, and I thought, people, gente, I don't recognize myself as negra. Janice's self-esteem and racial identity started to change only in the 2 years prior to our interview when she met a Black man who became her boyfriend. And she relates, yes, after I started to date a young guy who was negro, and so is his family, they had a very cool way, you know, of being proud, of taking care of their hair, but all within our means, like wearing braids or a cap or a hairband like the one you see me wearing today. So I thought that was cool, and he would say to me, "Mai, you're very beautiful. You have a beautiful smile." And that, to me, you know, started working on my self-esteem, and I slowly improved a lot. Today, you know, I'm happy. I like myself. I see myself as negra, you know. I look at myself in the mirror. I like to wear makeup. I like my smile. I like my teeth, you know. And in the South, it was nothing like that because there the colonization is totally German. And you have those farms that a father left for his son, who left it for his own. And in town, they speak German. So much so that you meet someone on the street and they say something like, é negra, mas até que tá arrumadinha. She's Black, but she's actually well put together. Dandara's and Janice's statements show that contrary to the argument put forth by those who refute the existence of racism in Brazil, undeniably African traits debunk our supposed racial integrity. Dark skin and crinkly hair turn the person into a non-person, as when she's called monkey or Medusa. If the person's humanity is maintained, she may still be labeled ugly and unkempt. Since the preservation of the sense of self is crucial for self-esteem, it is no wonder that some negros stop seeing themselves as such to the point where racial identity is reduced to this Black thing. It is also worth discussing the case of students who privilege their ancestry over their phenotype and end up fighting off those who do not see themselves as negros. Serena, 23 years old, and Monica opt for constructing their identity through ancestry, even though they are lighter skinned. Serena, social sciences student, describes a genealogical tree with an obvious variety of phenotypes with a predominance of whitening. Her paternal grandmother, who she says is not blonde but parda, her hair is kind of curly, but that curly that is not extremely coarse, once called her neguinha. Little N-word, and objected to her son's marriage to a woman whose skin was not so light. Serena's mother and aunts encouraged her to straighten her own hair and to, quote, get a gringo and get married, close quote. Perhaps as a consequence, Serena rejects the white aesthetics and claims that she has always seen herself as negra. I think my conception is more American than properly Brazilian. To me, it's like this. Either it's negro or it's branco. Like Teresa, Dandara, and Janice, Monica and Serena also bring up the issue of hair. Serena admits that her hair is super coarse and that she's fine with processing it as long as the result comes out as close as possible to what she considers natural looking. Monica admits that she has her hair straightened, but thinks that the result is too artificial. For her, getting her hair done is a matter of comfort, of being able to comb it through. It goes down to her back, and to wear it out. However, that preference caught the attention of members of a group of student activists at UERJ, whom she regards as too radical, because they try to impose on others a specific black identity and also create a space that favors negritude over diversity. In Monica's words, I don't know. I think that 99% of them are cotistas. If the proposal of the quotas is for you to transform the university into a plural space, where everybody you see, all the races, creeds, anyway, a group tries to raise a proposal for negros. I don't know, it's strange if you have a proposal of diversity, but you create a group that is so closed, so much so that a friend of mine and I have been chastised by the guys from the group because of our hair, you know. They say we are denying our roots, our identity. A young guy with dread said to me, it's kind of crazy. I can't take part in their meetings. Of course, I talk to many people who are members of their group, but I'm not that interested in learning about their proposal. Dandara also mentioned the group, but in a much more positive way. For her, the group was fundamental for her reaffirmation as a black woman. Inevitably instigated by the group, her reaffirmation involved a radically different relation with her own hair. The idea that it represented her link with her African ancestry and the fight against racism in Brazil. She says, for me, it was positive to have this contact with the black movement, to discover negritude, not this thing of, I have to value myself because I'm negra, but to know that I have a history, to know what my hair represented in African societies, spirituality, power, ethnicity, social status, to know that Lélia Gonzalez was a late 20th century Brazilian social scientist and activist, and Luisa Marin, an early 19th century enslaved woman who was prominent in a number of slave uprisings. To know that they existed, to start to discover and talk about things, because I always thought there was racism, but if I said that in high school, you have a chip on your shoulder, people would say. Arguments, I didn't have them. I didn't have readings. But you come to me today, you say anything, I have arguments. Not because the university gave them to me, but because there's a movement in here in which we study, we read. There's a movement of people who will come and say, how much longer are you going to straighten your hair? How much longer are you going to pretend that there is no racism? In some, with their sharp style, the members of that group act like ethnic racial entrepreneurs, a term that Pinto came up with. In that's a quote from Pinto, they try to recreate symbolic universes that unify the diverse individual experiences in relation to a normative definition of being negro. But if, on the other hand, the student activist group gathers individuals for its cause, if on the one hand, on the other, it also alienates possible members when it insists on imposing symbols not shared by all. After all, not all cotistas consider themselves negros. About the Parda identity, according to Petruccelli, a Brazilian demographer, starting in 1950, when race or color becomes strictly a matter of self-declaration, the Parda color category was chosen to be permanently included among the options. In 1980, the question became part only of the long version of the census questionnaire. Close quote. The fact that an official government agency employs a term does not mean that the term is clear for Brazilians. At the same time, lack of clarity is not a deterrent for the use of Parda among the quota students. Four interviews from the College of Dentistry and one from the Social Sciences saw themselves as pardos. For Ana, a 26-year-old social science student, the meaning of parda is simple. Mestiça, mixed, like the majority of Brazilians. However, parda may also mean morena, brunette. Helena says that racial identity is a good question. Amid giggles, she reveals that her birth certificate lists her as branca. But everybody says that I'm morena, that I'm parda. When I insist, she tells me she sees herself as parda, as morena, but not as branca. She adds, when I insist further on definitions, that parda and morena mean the same thing, a color in between black and white. According to my interviewees, parda may also mean pale. For example, at first, Sandra called herself meio parda, kind of pale, kind of parda, due to her lack of exposure to the sun at the time of our interview. And then she added, but I'm parda. I consider myself parda. When I ask her whether she has ever thought of herself otherwise, she confesses that when she was a child, quote, I used to ask my mother whether I'd be white, close quote. Because the neighborhood kids would tell Sandra that her mother was white, she wondered whether her skin would lighten when she grew up. Although she does not know for sure whether she really wanted to be white, she commented several times that she is getting white, in need of sun. Sandra exemplifies the point that many Brazilians value a suntan color over a color closer to white. A suntan symbolizes morenidade, right? Having tawny skin, which in turn symbolizes the positive aspect of being Brazilian, that is mestiçagem, right? Mixture. In other words, if being negro is stigmatized, so is being too branco. In addition, parda may also connote ancestry. In Sandra's discourse, she says her mother is branca and her father kind of pardo. But then she says that her maternal grandmother is negra and her grandfather branco. I ask her how her mother can be branca if her own mother is negra. And Sandra explains, it's because she took after my grandfather. So in appearance, she is branca, but in her blood, she adds that her father came out more pardo, but my aunts, there are some who are really negras. Some are more pardas, like sarará, as people say. You know sarará, right? The very light-skinned, with coarse hair, negroid features. She ends up volunteering that her own brother was born like really light with black hair, but now he's a veritable negão. Right? It's like unmistakably black. And if they write branco in the child's birth certificate, and today the child is negro, they're going to say, what is this? Did they switch it? In some, if on the surface the term pardo is restricted to color, more deeply it reveals a negra ancestry, which remains hidden until it's brought to the fore by an insistent interviewer. There was also the case of Beyoncé, a 21-year-old dental student who indicated that the options available in the self-classifying system that UERJ introduced influenced her own racial classification. Beyoncé, who today sees herself as parda, used to see herself as morena before she took the university entrance exams. And she says, there was branca, parda, negra. I thought, parda must be morena. In order to explain why she thought of herself as morena or parda, Beyoncé relies on uncommon terms. She says, it's like my father is negro, my mother is leucoderma. And I asked, your father is negro and your mother is what? My mother is leucoderma. She's what? She's branca. But what did you say? Leucoderma. And I laughed, so that's great. She says, it's melodermas with... I said, did you use that term before you got into college? I have never heard that term, even though I study race. And she said, yes, the black person is called meloderma. And I said, yeah, because there's more melanin, yes. So chances are that she learned the term leucoderma at the university. I find it improbable that she uses those terms in daily speech. I also doubt that she realizes that leucoderma is a synonym of vitiligo, a skin condition characterized, well, we know what vitiligo is, right? This example demonstrates that the university may also act as an ethnic racial entrepreneur. By introducing the term pardo, UERJ provided a context in which its students could see themselves as such. Once that happens, the identity may remain even after the elimination of the term, as it happened at the university in 2004. 3 years later, when I conducted a number of my interviews, some students continued to identify themselves as pardos. So what we notice in these discourses is how complex the category parda is. It requires more terms, more justifications, and more definitions than the category negro. Put together, those terms, justifications, and definitions lead to a genealogical, hair texture, and epidermal analysis, which even depends on the amount of color one gets at the beach. Of course, that exercise becomes necessary due to the interstitial character of the category pardo in a country such as Brazil, where phenotype trumps ancestry. By the fact that they are in the middle, pardos have the option of fitting as virtual whites, Elisa Larkin Nascimento's term, as morenos, or even as negros. If we take into account that over half of the so-called white Brazilian population demonstrably has some black or indigenous background and physical features, clearly many consider themselves white, conscious of the higher prestige that that category enjoys in Brazil. Since, however, race is a social construct, it is possible for that to change, especially if the non-white self-classification and identity become advantageous. In the process toward more acceptance of non-whiteness, which Brazil may be experiencing with the introduction of and implementation of affirmative action policies, it's understandable that some individuals may feel confused in regard to their own identity. And such is the case of the incerta category, right, the unsure category. 4 out of the 22 interviewees were not sure about how to classify themselves. Otávio confirmed, "I'm a bit confused. This pardo classification is new. I think I'm in the middle. Before the quotas, I thought I was moreno. It's different only in name, being moreno or being pardo. My family is very mixed. At school, before university, my nickname was negão. Maybe because of my skin tone. Never bothered me. Otávio has dark skin, wavy black hair, deep-set eyes, and European-like nose and feet and lips. In a country such as Brazil, where race is figuratively measured by a social eyedropper, Caroni's term, Otávio could be classified as branco, negro, moreno, or maybe índio, depending on the social context. In the school context, as Otávio noted, he was even called negão, which is a tricky term. Literally, negão is the augmentative of nego, which is a casual way of pronouncing negro, right? It's therefore black. Depending on the context, the term may denote familiarity, a compliment, even a term of endearment, or racial discrimination. For instance, the song Meu Ébano, My Ebony, composed by Nenel and Paulinho Rezende, and recorded in 2009 by famous samba singer Alcione, nicknamed Amarron, the brown one, is a node to a gorgeous, sensual, and irresistible black man. Do you know that song? I'll read some of the verses. Você é negão de tirar o chapéu. Você é negão de tirar o chapéu. So, yes, you are a negão for whom I take my hat off, right? And then it goes on. Yes, you are ebony, you have honey lips, a black prince made from a brush. It's pure melanin smelling of passion. On the other hand, depending on the tone of voice, negão may also have a derogatory meaning close to the N-word in the United States. Luis, a 23-year-old social science student, provides another example of contextual race. Believing that it's difficult to classify himself racially, he offers that normally he sees himself as indigenous, for that is his patrilineage. His mother, on the other hand, is branca, with many negro siblings. However, depending on the context, Luis may also see himself as negro. And then he says, if I'm in an environment that is branco in the majority, it's easier for me to identify with the other black persons there, obviously, because of my skin tone. I joke with a friend of mine when we go out at night to some place with many whites. I say, do you see? I'm the only negro here. And Luis, who studied social sciences, so I asked, where would that identification come from? Because he could also be moreno. And he notes that studying social sciences, which included the rejection of race as a biological category and the interpretation of mestiçagem, according to Gilberto Freire, the main articulator of racial democracy, has complicated his own classification, self-classification. He says, I've once joked that I'd be Gilberto Freire's ideal type of mestiçagem. Not branco, but also not Índio, but not negro either. The Brazilian, of course. But of course, things don't work that way. In other words, it only works for certain people. So, another one who feels uncertain credits Espaços Afirmados, Affirmed Spaces, a project sponsored in 2003 by the Ford Foundation to help retain the first entering quota students at UERJ. According to João, ESAF, the Espaços Afirmados, served both quota and non-quota students as its criterion was economic need. However, João claims that the project changed over time until it began to discriminate against whites by focusing only on black quota students. Vitória, 23 years old, also a social sciences major, added that ESAF had an Americanized view of race. She says, there was even a questionnaire to evaluate the course. One of the questions was, in which category do you define yourself? There were only 3 options, negro, branco, and others. That was shocking. And I asked her, which one did you pick? I didn't pick any. I wrote underneath, there is no option for me. They were the only people who discussed race, but with a completely complicated slant, too directed, as if there were only 2 explanations for what happens, the branco point of view and the negro point of view. And an important negro point of view, by the way, imported from the United States, and that didn't apply to us. So she gives us an example, an end-of-the-year party, in which the women students were encouraged to, quote, wear those typical hairdos, little braids and whatnot. There's going to be samba, of course, and our food, which is beans. As if we only ate beans. As if comida de negro, black food, were beans, comida de índio, Indian food, right, were yuca, and the rest is comida de branco. It makes no sense. Vitória's words are noteworthy because she faced ESAF just as she was seriously questioning her racial identity. After having thought of herself as white for most of her life, she was forced to discard that when she concluded that the racist comments made by her boyfriend's parents, who were of Portuguese and Spanish descent, were directed to her. Later, she confronted racism at Copacabana Beach when 2 security guards from a nearby hotel stood side by side with a white tourist right when she and her very dark-skinned cousin, who was visiting from Bahia, passed by. And the fact that she emphasized her cousin's place of birth is important because Bahia is the state with the largest black Brazilian population. And she says, a cousin of mine who's negro from Bahia came to Rio on vacation. I took him to Copacabana because every tourist has to visit Copacabana. So we were walking on the sand, and he was very casually dressed in Bermuda shorts, shirtless, and I was wearing a jumper. We were walking by, and there was a tourist sitting in a chair, sunbathing, all by himself, and there weren't any security guards, nothing. When we walked in front of him, 2 security guards came down to the sand and stood by. I asked, what do you think? Why do you think that happened? Well, I looked at it as, well, I'm going to pretend that I'm not seeing this. And so we continued to walk normally, but for sure it was because of the way we were dressed and for the color too, sure. I had no other explanation. And I asked, had you already started at UERJ when that happened? She said, yes, I had. And that's when I noticed why that was happening. Were you still dating your ex-boyfriend? Yes, I was. That's when I started to connect the little dots. But then she goes to ESAF, so she decides, oh, I'm negra then. I was discriminated against. But then as she's talking to black activists, she embraced a negro identity, but then that only lasted until she heard that she was branquela demais, like too white in a pejorative way. Just too branquela to be negra. So then she was confused. She abandoned branca, became mestiça. But that didn't convince the black movement activists who called her a sellout. Understandably, that angered Vitória and did nothing to dissipate her doubts because you have to assume only one side, as if there were only categories, either black or white. There's nothing else. So that's the danger of racial entrepreneurs run of imposing their ideas on others. And then finally, only 2 students in my entire sample declared themselves branco. Sergio Augusto, 20 years old, student of social sciences, and Rita, 23, studying to be a dentist. As expected, both applied to UERJ through public school quotas. And Sergio Augusto says that his father is branco, his mother is kind of, I'd say, parda, but he is neither negro nor pardo. To me, he seems to have inherited his mother's features, what with his light skin and very curly hair, almost crinkly hair. In the recent past, he could have been called mulatto claro, light-skinned mulatto, a term none of my interviewees uttered. However, he insists that he and his sister have always been very white, so much so that they were called branquelos. That is yet another example of that the idea of whiteness in Brazil is dissociated from racial purity. Having light skin might lead one to identify as white, even though despite one's knowledge of the existence of miscegenation in one's family. And Rita, to me, looked more the part. She descended from Portuguese on both sides of the family, and really long, straight, naturally straight hair, and branca is the least elaborated category among my respondents. Moreover, because the number of interviewees in this category is so small, it's difficult to go beyond a simple description. I would venture, however, that perhaps behind this lack of elaboration is the idea that white is the norm, the standard against which all other categories are defined and measured. Just as men was not a subject of inquiry until at least a decade after women's studies appeared, studying whiteness is still much rarer than studying the other racial ethnic identities. So, putting race, gender, and quota options in perspectives, it's fair to say that much like the majority of the Brazilian population, most of the quota students I interviewed conceive of race as a fluid and malleable system. For many, the formation of their racial self-classification started in their own homes and was very varied and complex. For others, their racial self-classification has changed over time, as we've seen, by distancing itself from the branca and morena categories. Therefore, quota options and racial identity are not necessarily the product of genetics, but the result of interpretations that the students have made of the representations of their ancestries and life histories. The fact that those representations exist in a context of high racial inequality perforce leads to variations in the development of racial identities. To argue that our racial identity is built on interpretations and reinterpretations relates to the concept of socialization, that we are trained by other people to be who we are, what we are. And because the family is the first and most important agent of socialization, children who grew up hearing that their families are all mixed, even though they are still seen as brancos, may assume a white identity. That can be reinforced by the fact that in the all-mixed Brazilian families, it's not uncommon for lighter-skinned children to be favored over their darker relatives, as Jorge Freeman has shown. In order for that identity to remain strong, however, it needs to be reaffirmed beyond family life. As such, repeated confrontations with racism on the street, the study of social sciences, and 4 years of college life may affect changing in racial identities. Gender also plays a significant part in the process of racial socialization. Be they negras or pardas, almost all of the women, but none of the men I interviewed, brought up the hair issue. Although contacts with activists who value negritude facilitate the support of Black identity over the ones in between, we know societies demand more physical beauty from women than from men. Physical beauty is associated with white features, especially lighter skin tones and naturally straight hair, which creates a color complex. The centrality of hair for the construction of feminine beauty is neither new nor particular to Brazil, as we know. And without delving into that history, suffice it to say that most human societies place a high symbolic value on hair. In an oft-cited piece, Sinnott argues, hair is perhaps our most powerful symbol of individual and group identity. Powerful first because it is physical and therefore extremely personal, and second because, although personal, it is also public rather than private. Furthermore, hair symbolism is usually voluntary rather than imposed or given. Finally, hair is malleable in various ways and therefore singularly apt to symbolize both differentiations between and changes in individual and group identities. Contrary to Sinnott, however, I suggest that hair symbolism is often imposed. As White has argued, hair is fundamental for women's identity formation. Indeed, more than men, quote, women struggle not only with what it means to be female, but also what it means to be white, black or Hispanic, straight or lesbian, working class or middle class, and so on. In general, then society judges women on the basis of their hair when it values long, naturally straight, silky, or softly curly hair as beautiful. Society sets an ideal that automatically puts women of African descent at a disadvantage. It's no wonder that the first black millionaire, as we know, was Madam C.J. Walker, who claimed who mastered the technique of black hair straightening, and she claimed to have received the formula for her products in a dream delivered by God himself. The ability to chemically transform their hair gave black women more control over their own images, but at the same time also reinforced the symbolism that good hair is straight hair. Except for a brief period from the late 60s to the mid 70s, natural hairstyles were celebrated as a symbol of black beauty, black power, and black consciousness. Since then, natural hairstyles, such as afros, braids, or locks, have been considered not professional or neat and may lead to decreased hiring opportunities. But the idea that having straightened hair makes people of the idea that having straightened black hair makes people of African descent more acceptable persists. For example, in the London Summer Olympics in 2012, U.S. gymnast Gabby Douglas was harshly criticized on social media by African American women for her hairstyle. When that happened again 4 years later in Rio, Douglas mused, I'm like, did I choose my hair texture? No. I'm actually grateful for having this hair on my head. Sometimes when you read hurtful stuff, you're like, wow, okay. In the film Good Hair, comedian Chris Rock explores not only the history and the economics of black hair processing, but also its latest iteration, namely hair extensions. Even though they're not a new phenomenon, they have become so popular among African American women that some see them as an indispensable part of their identity. As Rock shows, the most valued hair is that from India for its thickness, shine, and bounce. However, purchasing and having them sewn into one's own hair is expensive and time-consuming, which further differentiates among women. Moreover, while African American women consume that product, they must purchase it from Korean Americans, who control the beauty supply market. At one point in the film, the Reverend Al Sharpton, who credits the late singer James Brown for having first suggested that he have his hair processed, criticizes that practice by uttering, we wear our economic oppression on our heads. And African Americans often serve as examples for other peoples in the African diaspora. Therefore, representations about hair in the United States are bound to affect blacks in Africa, in Brazil, and elsewhere. In Brazil, too, naturally straight hair has been valued over crinkly hair. If African American women have made hair weaves popular, Brazilian women of all hues have popularized the escova progressiva, literally progressive brush, a technique that uses formaldehyde to straighten hair. In the second decade of the 21st century, that technique is known in the United States as Brazilian hair keratin treatment. Because of the high toxicity of its main component, Brazilian keratin can be even lethal, both for the hairstylist and for their clients. Interestingly enough, the use of that technique in Brazil seems to be more widespread among women with wavy or curly hair rather than those with coarser hair. In the United States, in turn, print advertisements for their product may feature dark-skinned women. Also, in a TED Talk, a young dark-skinned African-American woman reveals, "I have 20 inches of Brazilian hair extensions on my head." In other words, it appears that Brazilian mestiçagem is being sold to a U.S. market in the form of hair products. At the same time, there are ethnic salons in Brazil offering alternatives to the hair straightening. As in the United States, the natural black aesthetics in Brazil often fights for affirmation, especially in the job market. Chicalo, who also studied quota students at UERJ, noted that non-politicized UERJ quota students were more likely to consider their own hair bad and to see their politicized counterparts as more stylish for keeping their hair natural. Close to graduation, however, some women students had toned down their politicized stance and changed their hair to more mainstream styles. For example, Chicalo cited the case of a law school student who was told by a professor to start straightening her hair. In other words, law students are socialized to enter a conservative career where ideas that natural black hair is unacceptable still predominate. Therefore, a black woman lawyer might curtail her chances of upward mobility if she insisted on keeping her hair natural. It is thus utterly ironic, if not insulting, that a white Brazilian newspaper columnist saw it fit to criticize Michelle Obama, then First Lady of the United States and herself a lawyer, for her cabelo alisadão, right, her super straight hair. The columnist, Hildegard de Angel, admonished Mrs. Obama for keeping silent about, quote, this tyranny of the chemical treatments in industries, and encouraged her to react, exclamation point. A reader reacted by asking Angel, why do you dye your hair? Why don't you reveal the white strands? Have you asked yourself that question? To which Angel retorted that her hair means nothing because she's not the First Lady. As perhaps the most visible dark-skinned woman in the world, Mrs. Obama repeatedly experienced scrutiny of her appearance, as we know, in her own country as well. One well-known example was when she was called an ape in heels. You remember that? That was recent. That was in November. So we know, like, the pleasure that the woman who uttered that felt that when Trump was elected, because that would lead to a classy, beautiful, dignified First Lady back in the White House. And it turns out that she's not even going to move to the White House, right? So that yielded a response by the mayor of the town herself, just made my day, Pam, and they were both dismissed, right? Even though they apologized. So there have been several incidents of women, famous women in Brazil, being called monkeys. Ludmilla, the funk singer, she was also called, her hair was called, it's made of Brillo, seems to be made of Brillo pan, and so she's suing who said that. Then Thais Araújo, who was, the first black woman to be protagonist in a soap opera, was also called a monkey, and people wrote on her Facebook page, have you come back from the senzala, from the slaves' quarters? That hair could clean the entire floor of Rede Globo. You got into Globo through quotas, and I thought Facebook was for humans, not monkeys. And in response, she vowed, I will not be intimidated. There's also the case of, so there are many cases. Therefore, okay, so I will just end by saying that it is possible that the implementation of quota policies in the university is contributing for the reformulation of the idea of what it means to be Brazilian, the idea of nation in Brazil. And if that is really the case, then the quota policy has more than one function. It not only allows for the growth of opportunities for the social mobility of those who have so far been largely excluded, but it also promotes the emergence of new individual and group identities. Thank you.
Some people have to leave because of classes, but we have the floor open for questions. You can field them and talk with a couple of people at the same time and get a couple of questions and answer, or one by one, it's up to you.
I guess whoever needs to leave first, everybody has to leave for
Well, no,
classes?
People who leave will leave.
Okay, so,
I have one very brief and one a little bit longer. Thank you for your talk. The first question is specifically about numbers, percentages. What is the percentage of quotas for public schools and for, negros in Georgia and more broadly? How much are we talking about? Second question is, and I'm not sure this is exactly kind of the focus of your research, but I wonder if it came up. You mentioned that race to a lot of the students you spoke with is a fluid concept, one that's dependent on social circumstances and context. And I wonder if to what extent they reflected on public policy in a similar way, right? So in your conversations with them, is quotas something that is here to stay? Or is this something that, maybe in 10 years, they think students might be dealing with another set of questions because the quotas might not be here, and so that might affect, how they're thinking about race. I'm thinking about race in this way because I'm in this circumstance where quotas potentially apply to me, so that, well, okay, now I'm reflecting on race. But do they have the sense that this is something that is potentially permanent, that this might shape, race thinking going forward for years to come?
yeah, the law of quotas reserves 50% of the university slots to afrodescendentes, pretos, pardos, morenos, whomever. So that includes negros and afrodescendentes, public school students, indigenous, Índios, and also the physically disabled. Okay, so that was the controversy enough because I was too many because before, right, there was none. As for what the students think, yeah, that is in another chapter of my book. The law itself says that in 10 years the policy had to be reevaluated, but the law became federal law in 2012, and the students, most of whom were for social quotas for public school students, for students who had studied in public schools, but fewer of them were for racial quotas. Oh, that's racism, some of them, a few of them said, and others said, the ones who were in favor of it, it's like, well, it's the least that society can do, but they didn't see them as something permanent. They saw them as something that will help things out, but they will not fix Brazil's problems, right? And that is the position the argument that I make in my book as well, right? Because the proportion of Brazilians who go to university is very small, and then even with quotas, it's still very small. Brazilians of any hues, let alone darker skinned Brazilians. And so what about all the people who don't go to university and are continued to be called monkeys and being attacked? And then also going to the university is no guarantee that the person will not be discriminated against. So the quotas, the students saw it as such, and I see it as also a social reform rather than radical social change. Yes. Hi.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.
So I don't know too much about this, but I just remember seeing an NPR article about Brazil setting up like race tribunal in order to enforce some of the policies. Could you talk a little bit about that in terms of rather than having self-identification, having
Yeah, NPR talked to me before going to Brazil about that. And I think some people see it as extremely racist, right? Oh, it's reminiscent of Nazism even. But I don't think it's that simple because in Brazil, the people most likely to be discriminated against are people who are unmistakably black, right? They are dark skinned. They are, they look the part. And there have been a number of cases of people who, before quotas, had not seen themselves as black and were now taking advantage of that and going into Itamaraty, which is, the Brazilian Foreign Service, which is extremely prestigious and very hard to get in. Then there was another case of a guy who got to the Instituto Nacional do Câncer, INCA, Cancer Institute, also got in through quotas, like racial quotas. And both guys are Brazilian white, right? And it's, oh, no, but my great-grandmother was black. And then the article in the newspaper says, well, both of them had gone to Harvard University. Both of them had gone to like São Bento and PUC, like all these really prestigious schools. So they would not have been discriminated against because nobody would look at them and say, oh, yeah, you're black or you monkey. So I think the black movement activists got into the case against these people. It's like, no, that's fraudulent, right? So I think that in a place such as Brazil, where it's not ancestry, right, that counts in Brazil, it's how we look. So then I think the tribunals make sense in that case,
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how the conversations around racial identification in terms of quotas have expanded beyond the sort of university context and how it's sort of shaping the conversation around both empowerment and self-identification in a broader context. I know that in Bahia there's Natural Hair March, and so there's sort of broader movements around claiming an Afro-Brazilian identity that has a lot to do with like empowerment. And I don't know if that came after the quota conversation, if they're connected, or if it preceded it or not.
There are all these good questions. I think, well, if we look at the history of black movement in Brazil, it's an old history, right? It's not new, at least since, the very beginning of the 20th century. But I think and then when there was like the whole Black is Beautiful movement in the United States, it was the same. It went to Brazil as well, right? I have cousins who have really straight hair. They took after the Índios in our family. And at that time, they were washing their hair with laundry detergent so that they could get an afro because, their hair would not stand up. Oh, we want afro. It's like, okay. So this is not new, right? But I think, of course, the discussion gives more weight to these alternatives. At the same time, Ed Telles makes this point that the black movement, reivindications don't really reach into like a large proportion of the black and brown population in Brazil. Okay, that I'm busy doing other things, right? So I think we see more of it, but and I think the quotas put things like up front, but there's also this history behind it, so we can't attribute it all to quotas. Yeah, the intersection. Well, have you read Black and White by Skidmore? There's that's a classic book on race relations in Brazil, and like the whole idea of who is black and the ideology of racial democracy and how the Brazilian political and intellectual elite created this idea of mestiçagem, right, of racial mixture as a way of getting rid of this horrible stain that was Brazil has so many blacks, right? So we are bound to disappear as a country, which was the idea in the 19th century. And so there's one passage in Skidmore's book in which he says that in Brazil, money whitens. Which is not particular to Brazil, right? Other countries in Latin America have that too. And what it means is somebody who is darker skinned but has more education, more money, or more prestige may not be seen as black, right? So it's like, no, Pelé, but Pelé, look at this, there's no racism in Brazil. Look at Pelé. It's like, sample of one, Pelé. And, but then I would add that it's not just like because they have money, and because how do people know that people have money, right? There have to be certain markers. But it's all contextual. Other people need to vouch for that person, I think. So it's still, I think skin color trumps everything else, I think, in Brazil. But class makes things less harsh. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's like, no, don't you know that is so and so? But if there's nobody there saying, but don't you know that is so and so, then regardless of how the person is dressed, how the person speaks, the first thing they'll see is color, right? So then it won't, money whitens, but it doesn't completely bleach the person. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question? Yeah. Did I see a hand over here? It was you, and now you're eating?
Sorry.
That's okay.
It's not the subject, but I'd like to hear something about what UERJ and what's happening to the university, because it has a really important role in the quota and it's kind of policy. And I studied there too, so I'm really worried what's happening.
Yeah, so am I, right? If you're familiar with the situation, the state of Rio de Janeiro is bankrupt thanks to the former governor, who is now in Bangu 8, i.e. in jail, and he's said to be very depressed, crying all the time. And then people write, yeah, what about the families of those people who died because there was no medical care? Because what about, it's a mess, right? Then Pezão, the new government is saying there is no money. And so UERJ, as of last week, they didn't have personnel to collect garbage, which of course is going to, rats are going to take over. It's a huge campus, right? The 12-story building that is actually 24 stories high. No garbage. There are no people to man the elevators, and people were not receiving their salaries, right? In early January, professors were getting part of their November salary, 340 reais. Which is, so, yeah, like you, I'm concerned, right? There have been, did you hear about Abração? No. You did, like, people went to the main campus and held hands around the campus, in like a big hug, like hugging the university. We're here with you. But, and then now the government is saying that the state will have to sell the water company, SEDAI, in order to pay for UERJ to continue to function. And the dean of UERJ has threatened to close the school because they don't have money to function, right? Research is paralyzed. There's no money coming in. Classes have not started. They were supposed to have started in, I think, January 10th, January 23rd. They haven't started. So it doesn't bode well, and it's very sad that this is coming after, as you said, right, after all the role that WESG has played in this, kind of keep touching this, in the quota apparatus, because there are also people, right, I haven't talked about this here, who see the quotas as, you know, they're bad because they take anybody in. So to associate the financial demise of WESG with quotas would not be will not be below many people, right? They might say that, see what's happening now? Look at the university. So, but I have no idea what's gonna happen. The situation is dire.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.